All right, hello everyone. We are here for this new webinar on bioethics. We are lucky to have Professor Elizabeth Fein to present on the complexity of the ethical complexities of autism. And I leave the floor to you, Elizabeth. Thank you for coming and sharing your time with us.
Terrific. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you. I'm going to give a little presentation, just some background on some of the research that I've been doing and some of the questions that my research takes up. And then I would love to hear from all of you, questions, thoughts, reactions, and any kind of discussion we want to have around this. So let me give a little introduction to who I am and where I'm coming from. So my name's Dr. Elizabeth Fein. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I am both a licensed clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, and I'm also trained as a psychological anthropologist. So yeah, my graduate training was in an interdisciplinary program, the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. So when I was doing my dissertation research, much of which provided the foundation for the project I'm going to talk about today, I was working with psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, comparative behavioral biologists, a whole bunch of different people coming together around a shared interest in the intersection between person and culture, between individual and community, thinking how can we think and work interdisciplinarily to kind of consider across levels of analysis and to integrate some of the work from different disciplines to come up with a more contextualized view of who we are and why we do what we do. So this is a picture of me doing my research. I am dressed up as Brunhilde the Valkyrie Warrior because I am a summer camp counselor at a program that used live action role playing games to work with youth on the autism spectrum. Um, and so I'll talk a little bit about this program and this project during the presentation, but I put this out here just to kind of show that the kind of research that I do involves immersion in cultural communities. And sometimes that really means stepping into a new set of shoes and kind of getting into the game, which is exactly what I did here. So I have a book out that I'm very excited about. It just came out in July, and I'm super excited about it. It's called Living on the Spectrum, Autism and Youth in Community. And a lot of the presentation that I'm going to give today covers that project, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about what I've been doing since. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what do I mean when I talk about autism? Because autism is one of those words that gets used to mean so many different things. Different people use it in very different ways. Its meanings have changed dramatically over the past 50, 60 years since the term started becoming more widely used. And one of the things I look at in this project is the way language is very contested, right? What language you use to talk about autism really plays into some of these ethical complexities. So if you look at the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it defines autism spectrum disorder as characterized by restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, activities, and interest, and persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. Yeah. I can't hear you.
Sorry, the slides are not rolling.
The slides are not rolling. Oh, that is a problem. You're not seeing the slides roll. Okay, let me try this again.
Okay, perfect.
Are my slides rolling now? Yes. Okay. All right, great. Well, here's the picture of me as Brunhilde the Valkyrie Warrior that I want you all to be able to see. And here is the book. And here's the other book. I was just talking about the DSM. So the idea is these symptoms are present from very early on, causing clinically significant impairment. And so this is very typical of how the DSM describes conditions generally. It's deficit focused. It's focused on the problems that people have, the kind of clinically significant impairments. It's focused on observable behaviors, what people look like from the outside, things that you can see just looking at a person, as opposed to things people might be experiencing, or questions about why they might be doing what they're doing. And this is how the DSM is set up. It's set up to identify conditions as if they were sort of discrete disease entities, characterized just by their negative, visible attributes and manifestations. But if you talk to people who are living under the diagnostic description of autism, you often tend to hear something very different about what autism feels like from the inside. And very often what you hear is not so much about routine or rigidity or repetition. It's more about chaos. It's more about a feeling of being overwhelmed or disorganized, and needing to work to establish some sense of order and predictability in the world. So this is a quotation from the autistic author and blogger Nick Walker, who says that autistic brains are characterized by particularly high levels of synaptic connectivity and responsiveness, and that this tends to make the autistic individual's subjective experience more intense and chaotic than that of non-autistic individuals. So what's different about this account of autism, it's focused on subjectivity and the subjective experience. He's talking about brain connectivity, and he's talking about it in a way that's kind of value neutral, right? High levels of synaptic connectivity could be a good thing. But in many cases, it also leads to vulnerabilities, like this vulnerability to a sense of chaos. So when I talk about autism, not so much talking about autism spectrum disorders as exclusively problems. I try to talk about, in general, about autism spectrum conditions as distinctive ways of perceiving, processing, and interacting with the world. And these ways of being can pose great challenges, can bring great gifts, and tend to be very varied and complex in their manifestations. So that's kind of where I'm at in the conversation about autism. And when I'm talking about autism and thinking about autism, that's sort of what I'm working with. It's also important to talk about what we mean when we say autism spectrum, right? So often when people talk about the autism spectrum, they talk about it like this kind of linear, like a line, where you've got high functioning autism on the one hand and low functioning autism on the other, and then there are people who are all in between. And sometimes that can mean, how normal do you look? How severely or significantly are you impacted by autism? But sometimes it means, how much trouble do you have with things like language, or living independently and not needing other people to help you with things? So these terms, high functioning, low functioning, get used to index a lot of different stuff. How do you score on IQ tests, for example? So on the one hand, they capture something really important, right? It's really important to know that autism affects people in so many different ways, and to so many different extents. And it's also important to know that the study I did was mostly with people who, it started out as a study on Asperger's syndrome, which is a term that's not used in the DSM anymore, but was used to mean people who have some of the characteristics of autism, some of the social difficulties, some of the tendency towards repetitiveness and rigidity, but don't have the intellectual disability or delays in language development that we often see in autism. One of the reasons that term has not been used so much recently is it's just really hard to draw those lines, right? What does it mean to have typical language development? Language develops in so many different ways for so many different people. But this started out as a study about Asperger's syndrome, and so it's a very talky study. I interviewed people. I thought a lot about how people use the language that they do. It's really focused a lot on people on the autism spectrum for whom language is a really central part of how they engage with the world. But this isn't true for all people on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of variance. Then again, this term kind of low, I try to steer away from these low functioning, high functioning terms, because how you function is not always just a factor of your individual characteristics, right? It has a lot to do with your environment. I'm sure we've all had experiences of not being able to function as well as we typically can because we don't have the supports available to us that we typically depend on, right? So if you're somebody who, for example, needs technology to communicate, like you use an assisted communication device and then you don't have access to that device, that's going to really change your language function. But that has as much to do with the resources around you as it does to do with your own language ability. People also, change over time in terms of their level of function. So, I tend to steer away from low functioning, high functioning terms because I've heard a lot of people are not happy with them. But it is important to have ways to talk about the ways that autism affects people. And so I kind of like this concept of the autistic color wheel more than the spectrum, where there are all these different areas where people can get affected: language, motor skills, executive function, perception, sensory stuff. And people fall in all different places on this color wheel, and they're affected in all different ways and can move around over time. So these are some of the ways that I talk about autism. And the last thing I want to say about autism and language has to do with person-first language versus identity-first language. So a lot of you have maybe heard about person-first language as being an important and respectful way to talk about people with disabilities, right? So you say, rather than saying, Jane is autistic, you say Jane is a person with autism. And this is often supposed to be respectful towards the person because it says, you're not defined by your disability. Your disability is separate from who you are. But there are also a lot of people on the autism spectrum who say, well, you know what? My autism isn't separate from who I am. It's a totally deep, determinative, pervasive part of who I am. And I don't want to talk about it like it's something separate from me or something that I'd be better off without, or that I'm more myself without. So they tend to use identity first language. They'll say, I'm autistic. So I try to use both terms. I try to sort of use the language that the person I'm talking about tends to use. For myself, I kind of lean towards identity first language because it's more consistent with autism as I've kind of come to know it. But you might hear me use both of those kinds of terms in the course of this presentation. But this is a quote from somebody that I interviewed where she says, I don't think of autism as something I have. I never say I have autism or I have Asperger's. I prefer to say I am autistic because I'm autistic just like I'm female. To me, being female isn't good or bad. It's just what I am, and I wouldn't change it. And I think that when you say I have autism, the whole notion of person-first language to me is almost like saying it's a bad thing. So this is an example of someone who's trying to use language around autism to capture something that she wants to be known about this experience, that she thinks of it as a part of who she is, and that it's not necessarily a bad thing, and she doesn't want it thought of as a bad thing. And so these controversies of language really speak to the kinds of controversies that generated the project. And so when I first started working on this, I was intrigued by these controversies around what autism is and how we ought to respond to it. On the one hand, people talking about autism as a kind of a dread disease, something that we should try to find a cure for, that we should try to eradicate, that we should try to get rid of. And on the other hand, people talking about autism as something that they really valued, that they took a lot of pride in, that was part of who they were, and saying that to try to cure autism is almost like a kind of cultural genocide, right? It's like trying to eliminate a minority. They might make comparisons to things like race or gender, right? You wouldn't try to cure a Black person of being Black. It's the sort of comparison you'd hear a lot. And so drawing on some of these identity politic languages to redefine autism through these minority identity terms. And so I got really interested in how these kinds of controversies were affecting the lives of young people coming of age with an autism spectrum diagnosis. And I was interested particularly in how these two ways of thinking about autism seem to be drawing on trends in psychiatric science and shifts in how we talk about mental disorder. That on the one hand, people talk about autism as if it were in that very DSM-y way, right? Like it's a disease, it's all bad, it's separable from who you are. You could remove it from yourself, versus these new ways of thinking about conditions as neurodevelopmental, as rooted in our genes, our brains, these things that we're taught to think of as determinative of who we are, that affect how we perceive the world, how we process information. Again, these things that are sort of very central to prevailing concepts of the self and what makes us who we are. And so these different ways of thinking about autism were building off shifts in psychiatric science. So I wanted to know the growing number of young people who are coming of age with an autism spectrum diagnosis. How are they making sense of these controversies in their daily lives, in the context of their own developing identities? You know, very often in public discourse, you'd hear these two different ways of thinking about autism discussed as if they were radically incompatible, right? There's no, you can't cure part of who a human being is. You can't. But I knew that for young people on the spectrum, I kind of had a feeling that they were having to reconcile these all the time in their lives. So I was curious how they were doing it. So I spent 2 years doing participant observation in places where the meanings of autism were being negotiated and put into practice in consequential ways. So public school classrooms, private school classrooms, a summer camp, a community center, a psychiatric clinic and a medical school, a research lab testing pharmaceutical treatments for autism, a couple of support groups run by and for people on the autism spectrum, and a few national conferences, all of which were serving teenagers and young adults with Asperger's syndrome and related autism spectrum diagnoses, and all located in the Northeast United States. I did a lot of interviews with people affected by these conditions, people with a diagnosis, their families, and the professionals who work with them, through an approach that's, I use the term clinical ethnography. So ethnography means I'm immersing myself in these communities, studying a way of life through observation, participation, asking questions. I was sword fighting in the role play camp. I was sitting in classrooms, getting passed notes by the students. But also that my ethnography is informed by my clinical training. So I've trained in neurodevelopmental assessment, I've trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy, and a lot of these concepts really inform my work, even as what I'm doing is thinking critically about clinical concepts. So it's sort of this two-way street. It's a clinical perspectives inform the work, but the work also takes clinical perspectives as an object of analysis. So what did I find out? These young people I talked to, unsurprisingly, kind of thought autism was a little bit of both, right? They drew on both of these ways of talking and thinking about autism. One of them called it a double-edged sword, which I sort of liked. It brings in both strengths and vulnerabilities. It's part of the self, but it's also separate from the self. It makes them who they are, but it also profoundly disrupts their sense of self and the continuity of their identity. So for example, Thomas, who was 14, I asked him what he thought it was, and he said, it's a disease that affects people's understanding, and it can be very good for people, I think. So you see sort of drawing on these ideas of disease, but also it's saying it's something that's good. Or Darren, who was 17, says, it's almost like this part of me, almost. It's a way of describing and explaining a part of me, even though they don't even know where it came from or how it goes around. So he's talking about it as a part of him, but also as something that came from somewhere else, that goes around outside of him. And while it made them who they were, it also really disrupted their sense of who they were. So Christy was a 14-year-old girl who would have these terrifying meltdowns when she felt overwhelmed. Her whole world would fragment. And when she got angry, and she would say, I never really remember my anger things. I remember very slightly. I remember I was angry. I hit the teacher. Oh my gosh, I hit the teacher. I'm going to get expelled. So her sense of intentionality, continuity, memory were very much disrupted by these experiences. And so her way of thinking about herself was also somewhat disrupted and fragmented. She said, I'm half misanthrope, part creature of darkness, part anthropophobic, afraid of people. I'm just messed up. And so what I came to realize in talking to these young people was that this way of feeling part creature of darkness, right? Part something else. I have these things in me that is like kind of me, but kind of from somewhere else. It's kind of good, kind of bad, wasn't really well captured in these medical models of autism, either of them. Autism is a disease, something that's all bad, separate from you, or autism as this genetic minority identity, something that you're proud of, something that makes you who you are, something that, like, you are who you are, and that's just who you are, and that's it. Neither of these really capture this sense of the self as permeable and discontinuous, the sense of their experience as bringing them both power and vulnerability, bringing them into community with other people like them, even as it also isolated them and made them feel really different. So these medical models are kind of premised on a notion of the self as really sharply bounded, right? You are who you are, and if anything that is not you tries to change you, you stop being yourself, right? And I heard this a lot around a cure for autism. People saying, well, if I didn't have my autism, I wouldn't be me anymore. So this idea that if something messes with your hardwiring, it would destroy you, absolutely. But of course, you also hear this in the disease model of autism, right? The autism is a kidnapper who comes in the middle of the night and steals your child away and, leaves an empty shell. So this idea that if something changes you, it destroys you, really is grounded in this medicalized concept of the bounded body. And that didn't work for a lot of these young people for whom their sense of self was much more permeable, much more discontinuous. And so what I started hearing was that they were drawing on other mythologies from outside of medicine. They were looking to science fiction. They were looking to fantasy. They were looking at anime. They were looking at video games. They were drawing on these sort of speculative fictions to articulate a notion of the self that was less bounded, more permeable. So they would talk about themselves as being, like Naruto, that anime character who's possessed by a fox demon, or the guy from Soul Calibur who has a shard of an evil sword embedded within himself. They would reinvent their autobiographies, retell their autobiographies through these shared mythologies, and it allowed them to talk about their experience in a more comprehensive way. So I've really come to feel like when we want to understand medical ethical conundra, we have to look outside of medicine. We can't just stay within medical concepts, within medical systems and medical language, even if we're looking at medical conditions, looking at how people deal, for example, with diagnoses and these very medicalized concepts of the self. So this is another shot from the role play camp where, again, these kids were so into this camp because it allowed them to act out these stories. It allowed them to create these characters who were half angel, half demon, and to really work through some of these conflicts around who am I, and why am I the way I am. And so, just to close out a little bit, talking about the project I'm doing now, I've started to look at autism and other kinds of imaginative subcultures. So the project I'm doing now looks at autism in the furry community. So furries are people who are very interested in anthropomorphic animals. Walking, talking, cartoon animals, think like Disney characters, Zootopia, Fox and the Hound, those kinds of characters. And they often imagine themselves as a walking, talking cartoon animal. It's role play. They create a character for themselves and then they play act that character. And there are a lot of people on the autism spectrum in the furry fandom. I'm working with this interdisciplinary research team who's done a lot of demographic studies on the furry fandom. And depending on how you count it, something like 5 to 15% of people in the furry community identify somewhere on the autism spectrum. Maybe they've never been formally diagnosed, but they'll say, I think I'm somewhere on that spectrum. So there's a really high rate of participation. And so this project is looking at what are the furries doing right? Right? You always hear with autism, you hear about social exclusion, you hear about people not participating, you hear about people getting left out. This is a very different story. So what are they doing to support and facilitate participation at such high rates? So I've been doing focus groups at furry conventions all over the US and Canada. I've been doing interviews with people who identify as furries on the spectrum. And I've also been working with this team to integrate some quantitative data from their larger studies. So again, just thinking about what other kinds of imaginative practices, other than just diagnosis, which is also kind of an imaginative practice, what other kinds of imaginative practices are people using to figure out their identities and their sense of difference? So I'll wrap it up here with a presentation, but I'm really curious to hear thoughts, reactions, questions? Before I stop the screen share, is there any slide that anyone would like to see again? All right, and I'll stop the share and just go back to the big group.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your excellent and passionate presentation. I mean, you've done lots of research on the field, and the lived experience you gathered is certainly precious. Now, I leave the floor open for any one of you wants to ask questions. Again, if you want, you can type and we read the questions from the chat box, or you can just take the floor and ask the question yourself.
Hi.
Great.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Naima. I'm a Penn State doc student in special education, and my research interest is also autism, but I work a lot with mostly parents and caregivers. And I thought your research was fascinating. Like a lot of the things that I've seen with individuals I work with, I can see the overlap. But I was just wondering, like in your research, what have you found in regards to identity, for a lack of a better term, with individuals that require more support? So I feel like a lot of times when we talk about identity and identity first language, what I've noticed in my research is that the people that prefer those labels tend to be people that require less support and fall less on the clinical diagnosis. They don't have self or injurious behaviors, or they don't it's their autism seems to be a little less disruptive to their lives. I don't know if you've seen the same, or what have your experiences been in terms of requiring more supports, less supports, and identity in autism.
I think it's a really important question, and it's sort of an empirical question, and one that it's so far been difficult to get good data on, because it is true that a lot of the messaging around autism as a form of neurodiversity, autism, kind of more autism positive language, has come from people who are really active language users. And that often maps on, not always, but often maps on to people who require less support in other arenas. Again, not always, but sometimes. And so this question of how to hear from a wider range of people about their views, I think is a difficult one. I think one that could be investigated, and I'm not sure it has been yet. I know there are a lot of people who have done very wide surveys of people on the autism spectrum and found, fairly wide support for kind of more, you know, autistic identity models. But again, very often those are research studies that use things like surveys, that rely on people who can sort of independently find them an answer. And it's a little bit more difficult to access people who require more support to communicate, and people who might not have kind of verbal or even this kind of conceptual reasoning as most focal in what they want to be doing with their time and what they want to be doing with their attention. Um, so, I mean, I will say that in my clinical practice, I definitely heard a wider range of attitudes towards autism than when I went out there and did a research project on attitudes towards autism. When I do a research project on attitudes towards autism, I tend to get people who are interested in talking about autism. And so many of those people consider autism to be a very important part of their lives. In my clinical practice, I was much more likely to hear from people who are like, "This is not me. This is a problem I have. It gets in the way of my doing other things that I want to do, and I wish it were different." So I think there's a there, and I think that there is some more work to be done around, you know, helping to get a wider variety of perspectives from people who have a wider variety of conceptual and communicative styles. I also think, though, that it's a little bit of a two-way street. You know, I've also heard from people affected by autism for whom taking a very negative view of autism seems to, in some way, worsen the things that are thought of as symptoms of autism. You know, people who say, you know, well, I have this terrible thing inside me that I'm never going to be able to get rid of. And so why even try to socialize with other people when, you know, I'm just broken socially and it's never going to go away. You know, so if you have a negative view of your social sense itself that's very totalizingly negative, it does make it difficult for you to interact socially. So I wonder about, you know, things like self-injurious behavior or severe social withdrawal. You know, if someone is able to develop a sense of themselves as belonging to a wider world, having things to offer as a result of how they think and feel and perceive the world, might that be helpful for them too? So that's a question that I have, but I don't really have a lot of answers around it. I just think it's a good place to be asking questions.
So here we have 4 questions, Adriana, Amanda, and then Rona and Victor will ask the question themselves. Thank you.
Okay. So in the chat, I see a question from Adriana. Where did this notion that autism developed from vaccinations come from? So that has not been the focus of my research. There are people who have looked at that question more directly, done kind of more of a history on that work. I know Chloe Silverman has thought about that question a lot. Sharon Kaufman has some really interesting work on that question. What I've come across in my work is that autism tends to start showing up around the same age that children get their vaccinations. Around a year and a half, especially some of these more regressive forms of autism that are more kind of dramatic in their early manifestations. And so I think that has really fueled some of that sense. You know, there's also this awareness that people on the autism spectrum are often very sensitive to stuff. They're sensitive to sounds, smells, tastes. They have sometimes gastrointestinal sensitivities. And so I think that growing awareness has also kind of fueled a sense of, well, what if what's going on with these kids is that they're also sensitive to vaccination? You know, there's also this other thing that they're taking in that has thrown their bodies off kilter in a way that their bodies seem to get thrown off kilter all the time. So those are 2 things that I've seen in the course of my work that seem to be kind of fueling or supporting that perception. And then there are a lot of other things too. I think people distrust a lot of how big science gets done. There's a lot of distrust around how pharmaceuticals get tested. I mean, certainly we're seeing that now. And so, you know, I think that for some people who are especially for people who are very protective of their kids and who, you know, in some cases may have some of that tendency to really hyper focus on a topic themselves. You know, they become very educated about some of the flaws and vulnerabilities in scientific practice, and that can fuel some of it too. So those are some of the things that I've seen, but, you know, I would again direct you to people who have studied that history more specifically. Amanda asks, have you done any work looking at specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, auditory processing disorder, or other SLDs of that type? I have not personally, no, but I would love to. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me about autism is the way that it seems to encompass so many of these different ways that people learn and process differently. You know, I think that I've certainly heard people talk a lot about auditory processing and how, you know, it might lead somebody to do something like watch a Disney video over and over and over and over and over and over again so that they can learn to talk, and then start talking a little bit like a Disney video, you know, some of that scripted speech you see in autism. So I've heard a lot about those conditions just in the context of my work, but I haven't done specifically a project on it. Rona has a question.
Hi, hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
thanks again to Cal State for opening this up. Hello from Ireland, and thank you for a incredibly comprehensive and interesting presentation. Your work is fantastic. So I want to actually tie this in with my question actually ties in with that first speaker in terms of how, identity first language and autistic people with needs, greater or lesser needs for support. So I think possibly part of what is going on there is that our identities are formed in terms of positive autistic identity. We generally form that positive identity in contact with the disability community and in contact with other autistic people. It's a social movement that allows you to have that positivity. So most of us would have had a very negative perception of autism growing up, and would have found a positive way to reframe it in contact with other autistic people. And I think part of the thing is that people with far higher support needs and possibly with intellectual or cognitive impairments have much less access to the disability community. And if your sense of self is shaped in a care environment, no matter how well intentioned that is, those environments tend to be just inherently ableist. And focused on the impairment rather than on any sort of a positive flex. So just to tie that to, so I'm currently researching ideas of self and personhood in cases of severe cognitive impairment, including autism. So what I found really, one of the things you said that was really interesting was tying the individualist notion of the self to the medical model. That the idea that the self is this self-contained bounded entity. So one of the controversies in ethics and cognitive impairment is the assumption that people with severe cognitive impairments don't have a selfhood in the equivalent way that other people do. And that's, we don't usually say his name in my house, but so the work of Peter Singer and Jeff McMahon and people who, endorse extremely ethically problematic attitudes towards people with cognitive impairments. And those attitudes are based on an individualist idea of the self. We examine this person's individual capacities for things like self-consciousness and time, memory, communication. And what's terrific about your work that I'm getting is it ties in very well with the work of maybe Eva Feder-Kidde, Alice Crary, who have this much more open idea of selfhood as something that is formed in relation to our communities and to the people around us, and that can't be measured just by examining the individual apparent capacities of this person in front of us. So I suppose to turn that into a question, how do you feel your work could inform that kind of broader sense of what a self is? So I understand that your work is mostly with people with like me, with less support needs and no intellectual disability. But I think the work that you're doing could actually feed very well into as the first speaker said, cases of autism with far higher needs and perhaps a cognitive impairment. So do you see your work helping to support this much more broad, open idea of what a self is?
I mean, I would really like that. There are a lot of groups and a lot of people who I didn't directly engage with in the project, and I'm always, as much as I want to sort of talk about how my work might apply to those situations, I'm always much more, I feel much better about inviting others to sort of, like, I hope that other people will find it useful and take it up, but I wouldn't presume to say how. But I do think, I mean, for me, what's really interesting is the way that some of these other kind of circulating mythologies articulate other versions of the self. That they're out there, they're in culture, people are using them, people are drawn to stories, comics, movies, games, creative practices. And I think that those are things that you see in, across all communities. And so I guess if there were any implication that I would like to see my work have for broader discussions like you bring up about how can we be a self, I mean, I would say, first of all, just, yeah, there are other possibilities out there. And also listen to creative and imaginal work. Listen to the kinds of drawings that people make, the stories that they tell, the art that they do, the music that they gravitate towards. What are other kinds of narratives where we might be able to find other kinds of options? Yeah. Looks like Victor had a question.
Yes. Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. I was curious, firstly, if I could preface my question, if you can help me word my question a little better than I tried writing it on a note, and I'm not sure how to word it. So I'm a music major and a philosophy minor, East Bay, and I was really interested in. I was not expecting to see the significance of furries in the autistic community, because in any other concept, it just let's say if someone is kind of ignorant to what that community is like, they can come to all different conclusions. But I was curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the like what's the attraction between because I saw that that they participate in let's say like LARPing, is that the right way, like, and then animes and video games and even art. So is it something like um, the attraction is all the limited rules, or you mentioned something about some sort of script that they have to stick to and that's helpful, like music, for example, there's lots of rules, whereas maybe a visual art, at least in my knowledge, there's maybe less rules for visual art, but not to say that there's less action for visual art. But I was curious to see if you could talk a little bit more on that. Like, what's the attraction? What's the relation between the putting on another sort of, I guess, self in this case, like I'm putting on a wolf costume or something like that. Is it like the archetype of a wolf versus like a bunny or something like that? Like, and then you can, whoever's putting on that sort of costume, they identify as a strong person or something like that, or they want to, or.
I mean, you've hit on a lot of it already, and as suggested by your question, there's a lot to it, and I hear sort of two questions here. One is about furries, and the other specifically, and the other is about these kinds of structured role play practices more broadly. So in my work in a lot of different settings, I have seen the ways that these kind of genre structured imaginative practices seem to really appeal to a lot of people on the spectrum. And the sense I get around that comes back to that observation of Nick Walker's around the sense of lived experience as sometimes feeling chaotic and overwhelming, and the way that a lot of people on the spectrum seem to look to the world around them for materials that will help order and organize experience. And so, and sort of provide some structure and guidance. And so in role-playing games, and in anything that's very kind of genred, there's a clearer set of expectations about how we talk, what we're thinking about, what we're paying attention to. One of the manifestations of autism very often is an intense interest in something, a particular topic, a particular ordered domain. And so a social context that is organized around shared interest as opposed to free-flowing social chit-chat, a lot of times will be more inviting for people on the spectrum. And so, this is true for a lot of communities, for live action role play, for science fiction conventions, for a lot of these kinds of, I've heard people talk about like, oh God, what's the word? Circuit bender music scenes. So there's just a lot of communities that are organized around a practice, and often organized around a genre that has certain kind of social roles already kind of articulated. Furries in particular are interesting too, because of the specific things they do. And in the interviews that I've done and the focus groups I've done, a couple of themes have emerged. The first is that furries are very accepting. That's the number one thing that everybody says. Furries, as you mentioned, are kind of a stigmatized subculture. A lot of people make fun of furries, and there are a lot of kind of misperceptions about, for example, how central sexuality is to the furry subculture. For some people, it's an erotic thing, but not for everybody. And so, there's a lot of stigma around furry and furry fandom. And so, a lot of people who are drawn to the fandom say, we want to create a space where nobody is getting made fun of, nobody's getting mocked, nobody's getting beat up for who they are. So it's a very accepting community. There's a lot of other kinds of minority experiences. There are a lot of gender minorities. There's a lot of LGBTQ people in the furry fandom. So there's that sense of acceptingness of all different kinds of bodily experience and sensory experience and social experience.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. But then also this, like you said, this thing about role play, where you design a version of yourself and then you get to play that version of yourself. And a lot of people talk about how that creative expression and the ability to sort of play out and practice being confident, being funny, being outgoing, being more socially engaged. That's something that people really welcome as well. So there are specific things about the furry fandom, I think, too.
Thank you. Okay, so, and you even answered my, I had like another question as you were speaking just now. So the genre is not really, the genre doesn't matter, because I was thinking because sci-fi might be less familiar than like medieval, like with elves and dragons and stuff, but I guess it doesn't, it's the set of rules is what is the attraction too.
Yeah, it has something to do with the way that the concepts are organized, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So if I could even like, would someone on the spectrum be more successful at a birthday party versus like hanging out? Because at a birthday party, there's like a set of, okay, then they're at this time they're gonna open presents, and at this time they're gonna sing them happy birthday. Versus if someone invites this person to go hang out, there's like less rules maybe, and they're like, I don't know.
I think it depends a lot on the person.
Okay.
I think so, because some people might say, for some people they might say, oh, I'm expected to know what to do at a birthday party, but nobody ever taught me what to do at a birthday party. Whereas if I'm just hanging out with somebody, and we're cool with whatever we do, that's fine. Whereas other people might say, yeah, I'd much rather go somewhere where I kind of know what's happening and everybody kind of knows what's happening and we're all on the same page, and that's way more comfortable for me. So I think it probably varies.
Thank you. I hate both, I guess. No, cool. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Let's see. Layla has a question.
Hi. So with your dissertation in the past and even your research now, did you ever or have you or are you studying anyone with autism who is also paired with another condition from the DSM, and does that impact them in any sort of way?
Happens all the time. I mean, it's really, there's so much kind of comorbidity or kind of trans diagnostic experiences that people have. Some people have experiences that meet criteria for ADHD. Some people develop depression or anxiety as a result of some of the experiences that they've had. It's not easy to grow up as a neurodivergent person, and sometimes people will develop disabilities as a result of that. So I think that there's a lot of kind of commonality and overlap. I think it's pretty common, and I knew a lot of people like that. Did you have any question in particular about it, or just how much I said?
Oh yeah, like in your dissertation, in your research now, do you study any of that in particular, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I haven't focused in particular on those overlaps, in part because there's so many of them and they're so diverse. I think there are really interesting projects to be done on just the different ways that people experience all this stuff. The woman I quoted at the beginning of the presentation who said, my autism is part of me. It's not something I have. She went on to say, oh, but my depression, my OCD, that's something I have. That's annoying. I would want to get rid of that if I could. That's not me. You know, so I think it's interesting too how different diagnostic categories get experienced by people in different ways too.
Alrighty, thank you.
I have to sneeze, so I'm just going to turn off my camera for a second. Okay, back. Jillian says, how do you feel a parent of an autistic person with a mild intellectual disability who doesn't have a good grasp of language speak about them? Would they say has autism with autism autistic? Oh man. So that's a tough question. How do you talk about somebody? I mean, I guess the first question would be, does that autistic person have a preference? I'm guessing if you say they don't have a good grasp of language, they may not have a preference around it. But I think to the extent that you can get a sense of how that person views their autism, then, you know, use terms that reflect that. I also think to a certain extent, I think it's up to the individual what they want to do, what feels right to them, what their own perspective on it is. I mean, I will say that increasingly using identity first language is kind of seems to be pretty widely accepted as respectful. Whereas there are some people who will hear person first language here with autism and think, oh, that doesn't feel so good to me. But at the same time, there are also people who still really, you know, feel like person first language is important and what we should be using. So also, I would say, you know, saying somebody's on the spectrum kind of skips that whole thing. So that's also an option. You don't even have to talk about autism as something that's separate or not. You know, talking about somebody as being on the spectrum is a way of conceptualizing it that doesn't even kind of get into that language. So that's an option too. But yeah, I mean, my general advice, if you're not in a situation where you know what a person's preference is just to be as thoughtful as you can about your choices. Just kind of know what the ramifications are and make an informed decision and be clear about why. Talking about the history of vaccination issue, the Andrew Wakefield study in the Lancet. Yep. And then let's see, Jillian Fitzgerald. So I'm looking for, there's a lot of really interesting conversation going on in here.
Rona maybe has another question because yeah, the rest is a conversation between.
Oh yeah, Rona's got another question. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, only if no one else wants to jump in again. So another thing that was really interesting was your reference to mutant mythologies, and to the idea of the self as something, like we said earlier, or something much more permeable. And yeah, it's super common for people to have self-conceptions involving mythology or sci-fi or LARPing or whatever else. And I'm just thinking of a connection with work by other disability theorists and activists like Ashley Shue at Virginia Tech, or Gillian Weiss, the writer and artist, who are developing, so they're both people with prosthetics of one form or other. And they're sort of reclaiming the idea of the cyborg and developing an idea of the cyborg self as a positive thing. So that's sort of more in terms of, it generally refer anything from someone on dialysis to someone with a prosthetic, but someone who relies on a form of technology to live, and what that does to the sense of self and your interaction with the world. So I wondered, would you have any would you see any overlap, or is there any potential kind of link there? I love this idea of the mutant mythology as a sort of cognitive version of the cyborg.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap there in those kinds of conversations that are happening about the boundaries of the self and how we push them in various ways. It's interesting how much of this I see also in the furry community around. Especially there, I've been working with another group who are not necessarily furries. Some of them, you know, do furry stuff, but they identify as something other than human. So they identify as Therian or otherkin. They feel like they are, you know, I have a human body, but on the inside I'm a cat, or I have a human body, but really I'm a dragon. And there's just a lot of interesting conversations going on there generally about what prosthetics and technology might be able to do to help, change the boundaries of what bodies are and what bodies can be. And a lot of those people are coming from a place of, maybe in some cases disability, in other cases just a sense of kind of profound discomfort with their bodies in the world that might have all kinds of origins and sources. And so, yeah, I think that there are a lot of really important conversations happening around that. And I think centering the voices of people who have dealt with disability or who have dealt with bodily experiences that have been problematized in particular ways, I think is really, really important. So thank you.
Thank you. Just Gillian Weiss also has a really interesting comment on person first language, where she makes it a linguistic thing. So she prefers disabled person rather than person with disability, because she says with is a linguistic mode. I'm not in a relationship with my disability. So I always think of that when anyone asks me about person first language.
Yeah.
If we have time for one last question, Mark asked.
Yeah, so given the sheer variability of manifestations, is it really helpful to regard ASD as a single condition? Oof, depending on what you're trying to help with, I guess. I think that is such a good question, and it's such a tough question. I think that, to me, using the term ASD to group together the things that we group together does a lot of work. And that work serves a lot of different purposes. I think that it has allowed a really wide coalition of people to advocate for a really wide coalition of things, including accommodations or changes to social spaces to make them more comfortable and more inclusive. Greater awareness and education in teaching settings around the various ways that bodies and minds can be different. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the power of the ASD umbrella has served a lot of good goals for people. And at the same time, I think there are disadvantages that come along with it too. It's just very, it's difficult to talk about something that is so diverse in a consistent way. People hear the term and they make assumptions about person one that might not be at all relevant for person two. That's an ongoing problem. And I think also, there's this long-standing association of autism with aloneness, with, being just a autos, the self, being a self in isolation, and all these sort of early theories about autism as a fortress and the child trapped inside the fortress. And even if we don't necessarily think of autism so much in that way, that language of autism as isolating and individual and alone, I think still really hangs over the concept in a way that's really not relevant for a lot of people who are getting the diagnosis these days, for whom their issue is maybe they want to connect, but they're not able to connect in the ways that they want to, or the world around them isn't supporting them in the ways that they need, or maybe they're feeling too in contact with the world and there's too much coming at them. And so autism is so much a condition of like being in the world, that to use a term like autism to describe it often seems sort of troubling to me. So I struggle with that language. Great.
Thank you so much. This was great. I feel very lucky that you accepted our invitation and you shared with us, the results of your research. Personally, I really appreciated how you insisted on, describing the lived experiences of people affected. And how it feels, and you brought us a little bit in there. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions and the interesting conversation it generated.
Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all of your questions and comments. It was really interesting to hear your different perspectives. I've learned a lot today too, so I really appreciate being here with all of you. And please keep in touch. That's the other thing, if you want to continue this conversation, feel free to send me an email, and I'd love to keep in contact.
Yeah, and if you don't have her email directly, you can email me and I will forward to her. So we find a way.
Yeah. Or just Google search me. I'm not hard to find.
Exactly. Yeah. Easy. That's true. Have a good day. Enjoy the week.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, everyone.